All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. The next session we're going to talk about is the future of work in Asia. And I'm joined by Sarah Crawshaw and Steve Thomas. But before we get started with that, let me give you a little insight into what we're doing. So in October of 2019, IPR published a study looking at the future of work. And even though it had global companies, it was still a US lens. Some of the major findings were there was a rapid pace of change. We saw a diversifying workforce, an increase on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Even people talking about how the internal comm structures or the intranets were lagging in organizations. But overall, people said that with the fast pace of change, that they were making more investments in the people, reskilling, upskilling, and also having more contract workers. So a lot has changed since then. And we also wanted to do something that focused specifically on Asia because it is a very different region and area than US and North America. So what we did for this is that we did a series of interviews with about 25 communication executives and leaders of Asian headquartered companies, very specific that we were focused on Asian headquartered companies over the past year and a half. The last interview was conducted in February 2020, and as you can imagine, COVID hit. So what we decided to do is we conducted a series of follow-up focus groups in November, and we have one more, which will be this evening, and we will launch the study the end of January of 2021. So our panelists here have been they're both IPR trustees, and they've both been very instrumental in the study and been heavily involved in every step of the process. So let me introduce them to you now. So first is Sarah Crawshaw. She is a managing partner with Taylor Bennett Heyman. Taylor Bennett Heyman is an executive level search firm that's based in Hong Kong. She also consults business on their design and competency framework. She has clients all throughout the Asia Pacific region. She knows a lot about what's happening throughout the Asian markets and knows a lot of people as well in communications. And then joining her is Steve Thomas, who's the head of brand and communications for AIA, one of the world's largest insurance companies. He's also headquartered along with AIA in Hong Kong. And Steve, you've been at AIA since 2012. And before that, you ran corporate affairs for Citigroup in Shanghai. And you also have Asia experience or agency experience. And you've had a long tenure in Asia as well. So thank you both for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Tina.
All right, you ready to get started? Woohoo!
Let's do it.
All right, so we're trying to be very forward-looking in this study to not just say like what's happening in Asia, but really to say what are we looking at in the next couple years, and what are the challenges that communicators face looking ahead. But first, let's level set. We hear time and time again that when we talk about Asia, there isn't one Asia. So tell us what this means to you and what we heard in the study. How is the communication function different in Asia than it is in the West? Sarah, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. I think when thinking about Asia, it's really important to remember how big this geography is. It is hugely diverse in terms of the sheer number of countries. Every country is different. Every market is different. In terms of stakeholders, it's hugely complex. I mean, language, culture, technology usage, the stage of development between different markets in Asia is really different. You've got markets like China that are incredibly technologically advanced, and then you've got other markets that are emerging and where people don't necessarily have access to high-speed internet. So it's a very diverse region. And for people doing comms in this part of the world, what I think where that impacts them particularly is that if they're doing big regional roles, they've got to use a huge range of different platforms and channels to reach their target audience. It's very much more diverse in that sense than doing a sort of, I guess, a role in Europe or North America. And of course, people can say of Europe that there are, there's diversity there, there's different languages, there's different cultures, but it's to nowhere near the same sort of extent as it is in Asia. There's no political unity between these countries in Asia. And I think that the thing that we heard in the study continuously was all about the range of platforms that is required and tools in order to reach different audiences across this part of the world.
Steve, anything to add?
Oh, Tina, I think Sarah summed it up really well. I would violently agree with Sarah about the diverse nature of the region, whether it's stages of economic development, whether it's cultural issues, whether it's socioeconomic stages, and different mindsets. For example, when we at AIA launched our new brand promise a couple of years back, we were very cognizant of the need to invest in doing some cultural research that showed us, how we should best turn up in each of our markets. We wanted to be rigid about the what in terms of what we were communicating, but we wanted to be very flexible when we thought about the how that was communicated. And so I think there are enormous implications for communicators operating in Asia. And I think that's really important for people to keep in mind if they're doing business in the region.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about COVID-19. Global pandemic, it's first hit Asia and then a ripple effect throughout the world. Now we're seeing another wave hit as we await a vaccine that's more global in nature. So what do you think the impact of COVID-19 will be long-term on the communication function in Asia? Steve, why don't we kick it off with you?
So look, I think the impact of COVID-19 has had some universal outcomes for communicators, both in Asia and around the world. The need to do more online, the need to be faster, the need to be less formal and more authentic. And also something that came out in the conversations we had with the communicators that took part in this study was the intertwining of external and internal communications. But in Asia, I feel that the pandemic has helped bring communications to the fore, given that in the region, traditionally, companies have not put a huge amount of stock in the value of strategic communications. And we heard from one communicator in one of the focus groups that she'd become a head of HR, she'd become a head of operations, because she was sitting in so many different team meetings and was getting involved in such a wide array of issues. The need for hyper-targeting of audiences was also raised in the focus groups, making sure that the right messages are getting through to the right people. And then another common theme that came through was digital transformation, and the fact that with that was a step up in the demand for metrics and return on investment. And I think this will not go away when COVID eventually does. And then finally, we saw that through the focus groups that there's been a real strengthening in internal communications in Asia as a result of COVID-19. I think people are demanding to hear more from their leaders and in ways that are non-conventional. So we obviously cannot do the town halls anymore. And we saw in the focus groups a real trend towards leaders engaging with their people in more informal online manner. So I think that mix of factors has provided a catalyst to advance communications in Asia. And I think that's going to stay with us in 2021 and well beyond.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Sarah?
Yeah, I agree, with everything Steve has shared there, and he sort of summarized particularly what we heard in these interviews and focus groups very, very eloquently. The piece that really stood out to me actually was the internal communications, particularly because it's an area that hasn't been terribly invested in. If as Steve said, the stock of the communications function, strategic communications in this part of the world, hasn't been as high as it is in the US or Europe. Internal communications is an area that is vastly, I think, unrecognized in this part of the world, and that's a big generalization. But it's just not an area that people have sort of invested in, businesses, and I do think that this year that has completely transformed. Businesses have really recognized the value that internal communications has as a result of workforces working remotely, and therefore them needing to really proactively communicate to their employees, and as Steve says, through different mediums now. And I think the informal piece there is very interesting. I think a lot of Asian culture and societies are quite hierarchical. Hierarchy is very important here. And as a result, I think the tone of communications in the corporate world has tended to be to employees very formal in approach taken previously. And I think this year that has sort of fallen away a bit. And we heard from a lot of people actually in the focus groups that their management team have adopted a more human tone to their communications. They're communicating more frequently, as you would imagine in a crisis, but are getting comfortable with communicating more frequently and using digital channels. It was very interesting to me that you take this sort of traditional format of a town hall, and we've all had these digital tools at our fingertips before, but a lot of organizations have not been using them for that purpose and are now, and I think that will stick. I think that will remain.
Okay, great. Yes, even in some of our COVID studies we did that were global, the internal comms piece was really big. That some of the resources that they had wanted to put into it weren't until COVID hit, and then it seemed that there was a greater emphasis. All right, so we also discussed in interviews and focus groups some of the macro issues that we think will hit or be on the radar screen of communications in Asia over the next few years, such as sustainability and such. So Sarah, do you want to give us some insight into those?
Yeah, I think it was interesting, the comparison between the focus groups and the interviews that were obviously conducted mostly pre-COVID. I think the topics that stood out for me in the interviews were actually quite different to what came out through the focus groups. The focus groups, I think purpose-led business was sort of forefront of everyone's minds, and clearly this was on the agenda pre-COVID, but it's definitely being catapulted to prime spot for a lot of businesses, and I think that's probably true of businesses around the world. Interestingly, here in Asia, that rings true too, it would seem. The things that came out from the interviews, there were a lot of people who pointed out about payments being a critical topic for companies in this part of the world, because many Asian societies have sort of leapfrogged from paper money into cashless economies, completely reliant on mobile payments. And that has, all sorts of knock-on effects to their business and to how they sort of tackle that and communicate. And then I think also a very running topic throughout the interviews was the I guess the digital first societies that exist here in Asia, and how the lines as a result in those societies between personal and professional lives have completely disappeared. And you see it most starkly in markets like China, where it really is a very technologically and digitally advanced economy and society. And that is creating, I think, all sorts of challenges as personal and professional lives converge for communications from a corporate perspective. Very, very interesting. So those are the things that stood out to me, at least.
Steve?
Yeah, Tina. So let me just add a few additional thoughts. I think one thing that was prevalent in the focus groups was the general context and environment in Asia over the next couple of years and beyond really will be very different to that in the West, insofar as there's an expectation that Asia's economic recovery will be more pronounced and quicker than what we see in the West, and obviously that has an implication for communicators in the region. I think the other sort of aspect to macro issues that came out was geopolitical issues, and in particular the US-China relationship is one that is high on companies' minds in the region. And one interesting sort of fallout from that is that companies are being forced to grapple with issues that may be uncomfortable for them to be involved in, but they're being forced to address them whether they want to or not. So I think that will continue to be something that organisations in Asia need to come to terms with, as we see these major geopolitical issues emerge, and what that means for organisations and their interactions with a whole swathe of stakeholders. And then the last thing I'll mention is China. I think for those in the region, this is very clear, perhaps a little less so for those outside of Asia, but China is clearly becoming a standalone market in itself. I think one of our focus group participants pointed out that traditionally we talk about Asia ex Japan, but nowadays you can really talk about Asia and China as a sort of a standalone component of the region, just because of the scale and the nature of the market itself. So when communicators and organisations are thinking about doing business in the region, the markets like China, Japan, and the ASEAN markets are all very different, very distinctive markets which require their own communications plans and programs.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we also heard in the focus groups was we talked about ESG and how a lot of companies, especially in China, are focused on ESG, which is the environmental, social, and corporate governance. And in fact, a lot of communicators said that they were focused on sustainability. To what extent do you see this in Asia with companies advancing their ESG commitments, and how involved is the communication function in this? Why don't we start with you, Sarah?
So yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a general view that in Asia, Asia is behind the West in terms of its commitment to the ESG agenda. That's, but what we universally heard in this study and the focus groups is that ESG is absolutely on the agenda for a lot of businesses here. The E seems to be the much more active topic for a lot of organizations, and typically those organizations where it matters, where they need to show that they are doing something to sort of balance and contribute positively to the environment. But the S is growing in importance, and I think this year with COVID, that has come to the fore for a lot of organizations. Their people are demanding, their stakeholders are demanding much more from them. The governance piece, that's an interesting one. That's the piece that, for me, from what people were saying, and I've hosted actually a number of sort of roundtable discussions about ESG over the course of the last 2 years with comms leaders, and that's the area that is somewhat lagging. It's certainly in certain Asian markets, and I think it's the bit that will become actually an ever more important topic, as to Steve's point about the recovery here is likely to be quicker and stronger. I think Asian businesses, have gone global now, and more are going global, and that governance aspect will become, a big spotlight topic as a result. And the reason it hasn't, isn't as sort of far up the agenda, I think, is a lot of these organizations in Asia, they have legacy sort of ownership structures that are just not necessarily in line with sort of the governance principles that we see in Europe and the US, and that's it's got to come hand in glove with regulation and change on that side as well.
Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, Tina. I mean, I absolutely agree that ESG is becoming an enormous driver and influencer of how companies in Asia are operating, whether it's Japan or Hong Kong or Singapore. I know certainly as a publicly listed company on the Stock Exchange of Hong Kong, we are mandated to meet certain ESG standards and requirements. I actually think that from a leadership point of view, while European companies tend to lead on ESG, Asian companies are the ones that are emerging as taking substantive action to improve their ESG performance. And just as an aside, we heard one of the communicators in our focus groups talk about the fact that traveling mainland Chinese, particularly in the younger demographic, are really showing an increased and heightened interest and expectation that they'll buy from companies that demonstrate sustainable and credible ESG standards. So it's a big topic. I think it is absolutely on the radar screen of a lot of companies doing business in the region, and it's something that will only get more prominent, certainly in the eyes of both investors and regulators in the region as time goes on.
Okay, so now I want to go to a rapid fire round. So what we'll do is I will ask you a question and you have 30 seconds to answer. And then after 30 seconds, I'm just going to have to cut it off. So be prepared for that. Are you ready? All right. Steve, let's start with you. What aspects of communication will continue to be different in Asia compared to the West? Go.
Well, Asia is at a very different stage of development compared to the West. So I think there are, for example, a lack of chief communications officers in Asia compared to the West. And traditionally, as I think we've already touched upon, companies here traditionally haven't seen the strategic value of communications. I think that's going to be a big change going forward. I think with the economic rise of Asia, with the rise of digital and mobile, and with issues like the geopolitical ones I've talked about, we will see much more emphasis put on strategic communications by companies in Asia.
Okay, great. Sarah?
Pace and speed of change. I think we heard continuously from these interviews that Asia, leapfrogs, and it was a very popular term. I think that a lot of Asian companies are not encumbered with legacy structures and legacy concepts of what communications is to them. And as a result, I think there will be a leapfrogging rather than a catching up in respect to what this function does and where it plugs in for a business.
Okay, so we've talked about COVID and we've talked about some other like ESG and about the increase in technology payments. So what other trends or innovations in Asia outside of all this do you think will significantly impact the comms function over the next 18 months? Sarah, why don't we start with you?
I think specific sort of trends, I think digital and technology is key here. Really, the use of sort of new tools, apps, video, visual, these trends are the ones that are going to be affecting change here quite rapidly, I think, particularly because the region is so diverse, trying to communicate in so many different languages, etc. Now that people have really grasped the sort of the visual piece and the video piece, I think that is what a lot of communicators are gonna sort of be investing in, upskilling in that domain.
Okay, Steve?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Sarah. I think, as we've touched upon already, it will continue to be mobile first, particularly in markets like China, where I can't emphasize enough that the mobile is everything. There is a little value or consideration given to websites, given to traditional advertising, or even traditional media relations. So mobile will be everything. The other quick innovation I would mention is I think there'll be the continued rise of the influencer. Again, will be very local in nature. So, at our company, we're rolling out a regional ambassador program, but the ambassador in the Philippines will be very different to the ambassador in Vietnam, to Indonesia, etc. And then if I've still got any time left, I'll just quickly say the rise of purpose will continue to be a trend in the region. This is not unique to Asia, of course, but I think we will see Asian companies continuing to look at how to better articulate and take action to talk about what they stand for and why as we move forward.
Okay, any specific, rapid fire, any specific technology platforms or tools that will become increasingly important, Sarah?
I think I answered this in the last question, but I think apps, I think, because of this sort of mobile first approach in Asia, as Steve says, I mean, websites, they don't, in a lot of markets in Asia, they're not the go-to for information. So I think apps are a really big one. And then, I do think the whole piece around visual content, frankly, and getting that right for each different market, those are going to be the technology tools that people are investing in.
Steve?
Yeah, I'll just say perhaps we'll see more use of AI in the region going forward. I think that we'll see that manifest itself in a range of ways, whether it's how companies are interacting with their stakeholders, whether it's doing things like writing documents and press releases, or even conducting research. I expect to see that we'll see communications functions more actively and proactively incorporate AI into their efforts in the year to come and beyond.
Okay, great. Last question. What is one thing that you learned that surprised you in the study? Steve?
I'm not sure that there was a lot that surprised me. I would say that I was heartened to see that, and perhaps this is a sort of a result of COVID, but there has been a concrete rise in the appreciation of strategic communications in the region. And as we've talked about earlier, a subset of that is internal communications. I think that came through as a really strong theme as a result of the study, that we're seeing companies and CEOs really wanting better, more effective internal communications. And I'm hopeful that will be a trend that continues in 2021 and well beyond.
Great. Sarah?
Again, I don't think there was much that surprised me in the study either. I would agree with Steve there. But yeah, I think that one thing that was pleasing to me was that the effect of this year, people have found in this part of the world that their value and contribution to their global colleagues in Europe and the US, they feel that that they are more valuable and are recognized as more valuable in terms of their input. And that's largely stemmed from the fact that, you know, the crisis started here, and their colleagues have been leaning on them and learning from them. I think there was one surprise to me, which was really how the adoption of Microsoft Teams and Zoom this year as a sort of as mediums and tools has been quite revolutionary for some companies. And that was surprising to me because these tools were around before, but it was the fact that, you know, no one was using them in this way. And so I guess that did surprise me, and it's pleasing to know that they've now adopted them, and I think we'll be sticking with them.
Right. Yes. I can't imagine if something like this happened 20 years ago before we had video conferencing. I think we'd all be in a lot of trouble. So fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Sarah, Steve, for being on this panel and taking the time to speak with us about the upcoming Future of Work in Asia study. You've both been so instrumental and fantastic in this report, so I can't thank you enough for that. So everyone, stay tuned for the report as we launch in early 2020, and thanks, everyone.